The sun blazed over the endless stretch of desert, painting the sands a harsh gold that made the eyes water and the throat dry. Heat waves shimmered in the distance, distorting the horizon into a wavy mirage, and every step she took sank slightly into the unforgiving sand. She had been walking since dawn, her arms trembling from the weight of the water jar she carried, yet something deep inside urged her forward. The desert was quiet, too quiet, except for the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. And then she saw him. He was sprawled across the sand, half hidden in the shadow of a small rock formation. His clothes were tattered, stained dark with blood, and his breathing came in short, painful gasps. At first, she froze, unsure if it was even safe to approach. Tales of wandering tribes and skirmishes between settlers and the Apache had filled her childhood, and the stories warned of danger. But the moment she looked into his face, she saw something that transcended fear, a man in need, wounded and alone, struggling for each breath. Her hand instinctively went to the water jar, the one she had carried with her for miles, and her heart pushed her forward as she knelt beside him. The heat pressed down, the sand burning through her thin shoes, yet the stranger's pain overshadowed all discomfort. She offered him the water, her voice shaking but soft. "Here, drink," she whispered, careful to keep her distance yet close enough to hand him the jar. The silence of the desert seemed to lean in, holding its breath, as if the world itself were waiting to see what would happen next. He looked at her with eyes wide and wary, muscles tense beneath the bruises and dust. For a long moment, he said nothing, and then, almost imperceptibly, he took the jar from her hands. Relief washed over her, mingled with a caution she could not shake. In that instant, she realized she knew nothing of this man beyond what her eyes could see. His appearance alone told a story of survival and struggle, an Apache warrior, scarred by the unforgiving land and the battles it had forced him into. But there was something more, a depth in his gaze that hinted at honor, courage, and perhaps something else entirely. She felt a shiver run down her spine. The desert was vast, but somehow, in that moment, it felt impossibly small, her fate tied to the stranger before her. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and distant smoke, twisting the heat into a restless whirlwind. She noticed a jagged cut along his arm, deep and ragged, and realized he had been hurt in a skirmish. Blood clung stubbornly to the fabric of his sleeve, soaking through in places, and the sight made her stomach tighten. She had grown up hearing whispers of what the desert could take from a person, how it tested even the strongest, and she now understood firsthand. Without thought, she reached for a cloth in her bag. Kneeling closer despite the warnings etched into every story she had ever heard, his eyes followed her movements. Cautious, but curious, as she began to dab at the wound. The tension between them was electric. A fragile thread stretched across centuries of conflict and fear. She was aware of every detail, the slight flinch when she touched his skin, the way his fingers twitched as if ready to defend himself, the steadying of his breathing as he adjusted to the water she had given him. She had no idea what he would do next, and for a moment, terror threatened to take hold. "Why? Help me." His voice was low, rough, a whisper that carried across the desert like a secret. He was clearly unused to such gestures of kindness, and the words hung between them, heavy with history and mistrust. She could only shake her head slightly, unable to articulate why instinct had driven her to offer him water, why her humanity demanded it even in the face of fear. The silence stretched. Around them, the desert seemed to pulse with life, the wind carrying the cries of distant coyotes, the fluttering of hawks overhead, the shifting of sand under invisible forces. She could almost hear the desert watching, as if it were aware that this encounter was something more than chance. Her heart raced, partly from the heat, partly from the uncertainty of what might come next. And then he did something she could never have predicted. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his hand over hers on the water jar, holding it there for a moment that felt like a lifetime. It was not just a gesture of gratitude. It was a recognition, a silent acknowledgement that in this harsh and lonely place, a bond had been formed. She felt a strange mix of relief, fear, and curiosity swirl through her. for she knew the desert was not a place of easy trust. But before she could speak, a sudden movement on the horizon caught her eye. Dust swirled in the distance, forming into shapes that suggested someone or something was approaching. She glanced at him, and for the first time she saw the tension break, replaced by a sharp alertness, a warrior's readiness. He was no longer just a wounded man. He was a protector, a force shaped by the desert itself. Her heart quickened as she realized they were both now on edge, each sensing the presence of others nearby. And the fragile trust they had begun to build could be threatened at any moment. She wanted to ask him who he was, where he came from, what his story might be. But the questions stuck in her throat. There was no time. The desert had a way of demanding attention, of forcing decisions in the blink of an eye. And as the figures drew closer, their outlines blurry in the heat shimmer. She understood that this encounter, simple, human, and extraordinary, was only the beginning. Whatever came next would test both of them in ways she could not yet imagine. The sun dipped lower in the sky, turning the desert sands to a molten copper, and shadows stretched long and thin across the ground. She tightened her grip on the water jar, feeling the rough warmth of his hand still lingering over hers, and the sense of anticipation grew unbearable. What had started as a simple act of kindness had already changed everything. In the harsh desert, where survival was never guaranteed, she had offered water to a wounded Apache, and what he might do in return could alter both of their fates forever. And then, just as the wind shifted, bringing with it the faint smell of smoke and gunpowder, he stood, not with weakness, but with a quiet strength that made her step back. Her pulse pounded in her ears as he scanned the horizon, the tension in his body coiled like a spring ready to release. She realized she had no idea what he was planning, no clue what his next move would be. And it terrified and fascinated her all at once. The desert seemed to hold its breath, and in that suspended moment, everything hung in the balance. The story of their meeting, the act of water shared, the unspoken connection, and the shadow of danger approaching was far from over. The sun was falling, and with it, the day's warmth would fade into night, bringing new challenges, new threats, and perhaps new revelations. She had taken a step into something far greater than herself, something that would test courage, trust, and the very essence of who they were. And as she watched him, poised between pain and power, gratitude and wariness, she knew that what came next would shock her in ways she could never have imagined. The desert stretched endlessly around them, a vast ocean of sand and rock, yet somehow, in the presence of the wounded man, it felt smaller, tighter, like the world had narrowed to the space between them. She studied him more closely now, curiosity mingling with caution. His face was lined not just with exhaustion, but with a lifetime of struggle and survival. The way he held himself, even in pain, suggested a warrior forged by the harshness of the land, someone who had endured more than most could imagine. She wondered what had brought him to this state, why he had been left alone to fight the desert's cruelty. He did not speak, only kept his eyes on the horizon, muscles tensed and ready. She sensed that whatever had wounded him was more than an accident, more than a simple skirmish. There was a story here, one that stretched beyond the moments of sand and heat into something larger, older, and far more dangerous. She tried to read the lines of his face, searching for a clue, but he remained an enigma, his expression unreadable. Her own story seemed insignificant in comparison, yet she felt the pull of responsibility. She had grown up on the edges of the settlements, learning the ways of the desert from an early age, how to read the tracks of animals, how to find water in hidden places, how to survive when the land seemed set against you. Still, none of that training prepared her for this. Nothing could prepare anyone for the fragile, tense connection she now shared with a man whose entire life had been shaped by violence, survival, and honor. As they both remained still, the wind shifted again, carrying whispers of movement from the far-off horizon. She could see the shimmer of heat hiding shapes, but even the distance could not disguise the intent behind them. Figures mounted on horses, moving steadily, almost too deliberately to be wandering travelers. Her pulse quickened. Whatever was coming, it was not friendly. He noticed the movement at the same moment, his eyes narrowing. The way he shifted his stance, still keeping himself partly low to the ground, revealed a man who had been trained for danger. And yet there was no immediate aggression. He was cautious, calculating, waiting to understand before acting. She realized then that his survival had depended on this kind of patience, on knowing when to act and when to hold back. It was a skill she had never learned because until now, she had never needed to. She wanted to ask him who he was running from, who had caused him this pain, but the words caught in her throat. Something told her that answers could wait. For now, the priority was the moment, the immediate reality of the desert and the approaching figures. She adjusted the water jar at her side, making sure it was within reach, and silently wondered if it could become more than a gesture of kindness. It might be a lifeline if the danger turned toward them. The wounded man finally moved, slowly rising despite the pain in his body. She felt her stomach tighten as he straightened, his strength evident despite the blood and bruises. He scanned the horizon again, then looked back at her, and for the first time he spoke a single word: hide. His voice was low, almost a growl, but there was a weight behind it that demanded obedience. She nodded, instinctively understanding that he was not issuing a mere suggestion. They moved toward a jagged outcrop of rocks, the shadows growing longer as the sun lowered further. She followed him closely, careful not to make a sound that might betray their position. Every step was measured, every breath deliberate, and she marveled at how naturally he moved despite his injury. There was a rhythm to his movements, an intimate knowledge of the land that suggested years of practice and instinct. She realized then that she had been wrong to think of him as simply wounded and helpless. He was a survivor, a man of skill and intelligence, honed by necessity as they crouched behind the rocks. She caught her first glimpse of the approaching figures in detail. There were at least 4 of them riding swiftly, their clothes dark against the sunlit sands. Guns glinted in the dying light, and she saw the hard expressions on their faces. It was clear that they were not just travelers. They were hunters, or perhaps men with a score to settle. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had never been so close to true danger, yet she could not look away. The wounded man watched them carefully, his eyes narrowing with a focus that seemed almost painful in its intensity. He muttered something under his breath in a language she did not understand, but the tone carried meaning enough: plans, warnings, strategies forming in the desert heat. She realized she was witnessing the instincts of a seasoned fighter, someone who had faced threats before and survived by sheer cunning and skill. And yet, beneath the calculation, she sensed another layer: a code of honor, a sense of justice shaped by a life on the margins. Outside the laws of settlers and towns alike, she thought of the water jar in her hands, and a strange thought struck her. This simple act of pouring water to a man she did not know, in a place that demanded caution above all, had bound their fates together in a way she could not yet understand. The desert had a way of testing people, forcing them into alliances, into moments where kindness and survival intertwined. And now, she was part of something larger than herself, a story she could not yet see the full scope of. The figures drew closer. She could hear the faint clatter of hooves against rock and sand. Dust swirled around them, and the heat made the air seem to shimmer, bending reality at the edges. She saw the tension in the man beside her, felt the alertness in every fiber of his body. He was ready to defend, to strike, to protect, but she sensed that he would rather avoid violence if possible. His strength was a quiet force, a shield that demanded respect without boasting. She realized she had never encountered such presence before, someone whose mere being commanded attention and caution. Hours seemed to pass in the few minutes of waiting, the sun sinking lower with each tick of the clock. She tried to remain calm, but the fear in her chest would not ease. She could not help but think of what had led him here, alone in the desert, wounded and desperate. Who had done this to him? Why had he been left to struggle alone? And what would these riders do when they reached this point? Questions tumbled through her mind, yet no answers came. Finally, the wounded man shifted his weight, preparing to move again. He glanced at her, eyes sharp and commanding, and she understood without words that whatever came next, she had to trust him completely. It was a leap into uncertainty, into danger, yet something in his presence made her believe they could survive if they stayed together. She realized that the desert, which had always seemed cruel and unyielding, now held possibilities strange, fragile promise of connection, of protection, and perhaps even understanding between two unlikely companions. The riders were closer now, shapes looming through the heat haze, and the desert seemed to grow silent around them. Only the crunch of sand under hooves and the occasional hiss of the wind broke the tension. She tightened her grip on the water jar, feeling its weight and the symbol it had become, a small token of human kindness in a vast and dangerous land. Her thoughts raced, wondering what would happen when the riders discovered them. What choices would have to be made, and whether the fragile bond she had begun to form with this stranger would be enough to protect them both. He looked at her one last time before moving out from behind the rocks, silent command to follow. She obeyed, heart pounding, every nerve alert. The desert stretched before them, wide and empty, yet the threat approached with relentless certainty. She realized then that nothing in her life had prepared her for this moment. Not the stories, not the lessons, not the quiet days at the edge of the settlement. This was a test of courage, of intuition, and of trust, and she was being forced to meet it head-on. The sun dipped toward the horizon, turning the sands a burning red, and the shadows of the approaching riders lengthened. The wounded man led her forward, every step deliberate, every movement purposeful. She could feel the tension between them, an unspoken understanding that their fates were now intertwined. Danger awaited, unknown and unpredictable, yet she could not turn back. The desert had taken hold of them both. There was no escaping its trials. As they moved, the wind shifted again, carrying a faint scent of smoke. Her stomach twisted. Something had happened nearby, something that promised trouble, yet she could not see it. The wounded man glanced at her, a flicker of concern passing over his features, and she felt the weight of the moment settle around them. Their journey had only just begun, and already the desert had demanded everything: courage, patience, and the willingness to face the unknown. With the sun dipping behind distant cliffs, the desert stretched into a palette of orange and shadow, and the riders grew closer, their intentions unclear. She tightened her grip on the water jar, the first act that had brought them together, and realized that whatever came next, she would need every ounce of courage she could summon. The desert had become a crucible, and in its heat, they would soon discover whether kindness could survive alongside danger, whether trust could endure in a land shaped by conflict. And as the first stars began to appear in the vast, endless sky above, she knew that this was only the beginning of a story far larger than herself, one that would test the limits of courage, honor, and the bond between two people thrown together by chance in the harsh, unyielding desert. The desert was growing colder now as the sun dipped behind the distant cliffs, leaving long shadows that stretched like fingers across the sand. The wounded man moved with a careful rhythm, every step deliberate, and she followed as quietly as she could, aware that the slightest sound might give them away. The riders were still approaching, though the heat haze made it hard to tell exactly how many there were or how close. Each moment stretched unbearably, the silence between them heavy and full of unspoken questions. She glanced at him, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes scanned every ridge and crevice in the rocks. She realized that the desert had taught him vigilance in a way she had never experienced. Each movement of the wind, each distant sound, seemed to carry meaning. He was reading the landscape, measuring danger, calculating how best to survive. She felt both admiration and a prickling fear, realizing that she had never truly understood what it meant to live in a world where every decision could mean life or death. The riders, for a number, moved with a quiet confidence that unsettled her. They were men shaped by the frontier, faces weathered by the sun, hands steady on their rifles. There was no hurry in their movements, only the careful certainty of people who knew exactly what they wanted and how to take it. She shivered, despite the warmth of the day fading, sensing that they were not just passing travelers, they were looking for someone. And she feared that someone might be the wounded man beside her. He noticed her glance and gave a subtle shake of his head, a warning not to stare too openly. She understood the gesture, feeling the weight of his authority in a way that startled her. Here was a man who, despite being injured, commanded presence, and demanded caution. She wondered how he had ended up in this situation, alone and hurt in the desert, and what enemies had brought him to the edge of death. The questions circled in her mind like desert hawks, but she knew now was not the time for answers. Survival came first. They reached a small cluster of rocks that formed a natural alcove. Low enough to hide behind, but high enough to give them some view of the approaching riders. He crouched immediately, signaling her to do the same. She obeyed, pressing herself close to the warm rock, listening as the riders drew nearer. The crunch of hooves against sand was louder now, each sound amplified in the quiet of the desert evening. She could see the determination on the men's faces, the way their eyes scanned the landscape as though they already expected to find their target. For a moment, she allowed herself to think of who these riders might be. Were they bounty hunters, drawn by reward? Settlers seeking revenge? Or perhaps lawmen, trying to impose order on a land where rules were fragile at best? She realized she did not know the complexities of frontier justice, did not understand the way the desert could twist morality into something strange and unforgiving. All she knew was that danger was coming, and she had nowhere to run except with the wounded man, whose trust she had earned in the smallest of gestures. Offering water, the wounded man muttered something under his breath again, a string of words she could not understand. His lips moved with urgency, but the sound was low, almost swallowed by the wind. He shifted slightly, adjusting his position behind the rock, and she followed his movements closely. She realized that in this moment she was learning the language of survival, of reading someone's intentions through movement, glance, and breath. It was a skill she had never possessed before, yet now it felt essential, like a lifeline threading her to him in the desert silence. A sudden movement caught her, Aja hawk swooping down to snatch prey, and she realized how easily the desert could mask danger. The riders could be closer than she thought, hidden by the undulating sand, and the thought made her stomach tighten. She wished for a weapon, anything to defend herself. But she had nothing beyond her wits and the fragile trust she shared with the man beside her. She looked at him, noting the calm that masked the tension coiled in his body. Even injured, he was a force, a presence that commanded the desert itself to bend around him. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint scent of smoke. Her heart skipped a beat, wondering if a campfire was near or if this was the remnants of some conflict they had missed. He caught the smell too, nostrils flaring, eyes narrowing. She realized he was piecing together a story from fragments she could barely perceive, the direction of the smoke, the way the riders moved, even the smallest signs left in the sand. The desert was a puzzle he could read and she could only follow. Trusting that his knowledge would see them through, minutes passed in silence, each one stretching longer than the last. Then he whispered something, almost imperceptibly, in his native tongue. She could not understand, but she felt the urgency, the warning, the strategy behind the words. He was planning, calculating, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. She realized that this was not merely a chase-it, was a test of patience, of courage, and of instinct. Every choice mattered. Every delay was dangerous. She thought of the water jar in her hands and the strange symbolism it had come to hold. It was more than a vessel of life. It was a symbol of trust, of a small kindness, in a world that had been harsh and unforgiving. That single act had connected them, forming a fragile bond that might be the difference between survival and disaster. She wondered if he realized the power of that simple gesture, and if it gave him the hope or motivation to endure the pain and the danger he faced. The riders were close enough now that she could hear murmurs. Low voices carried across the desert. She could not understand the words, but she could sense the threat in the tones, the certainty in their movements. They were experienced, practiced, and relentless. And she felt a chill run through her despite the lingering warmth of the sand. She knew that the man beside her had faced threats like this before. Yet she also knew that each encounter carried its own risks, and this one was far from guaranteed to end well. Her mind wandered briefly to the settlements. She had known as a child the small towns with wooden buildings, the smell of smoke and cooking fires, the sense of fragile community. Compared to the desert, Those places seemed safe, almost unreal. And yet, even in those towns, she had seen cruelty, fear, and violence. Here in the open desert, there were no walls, no lawmen to intervene, no one to help if they were discovered. It was a raw, primal place where every decision could tip the balance between life and death. He shifted again, preparing to move, and she mirrored his movements. Her pulse raced, but she forced herself to remain calm, aware that panic would be deadly. She was beginning to understand the rhythm of the desert, the way it demanded attention and patience. Each shadow, each sound, each grain of sand could carry meaning, and she realized she was learning to read it alongside him. They were moving as one, not just in proximity, but in awareness. A partnership formed in the crucible of danger. The riders were almost upon them, yet he did not attack. He waited, calculating, allowing the desert and the shadows to work to their advantage. She felt a strange admiration for his restraint, realizing that survival was not just about brute strength, but about understanding when to act and when to hold back. She could see the tension coiling in his body, ready to spring into motion at the precise moment, and she knew that whatever happened next would depend entirely on timing, instinct, and the bond they had formed in these few, fleeting hours. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to wonder who this man really was, where he came from, and what had shaped him into the person she now relied on for survival. His life was a mystery, his past hidden beneath scars, dust, and silence. And yet, she could sense a story behind his eyes, a story of hardship, courage, and honor. Something that had brought him to this desert and placed him in her path. She felt a strange connection to him, as though the desert had deliberately brought them together, testing both of them in ways they could not yet understand. The sun disappeared completely, leaving a deepening twilight, and the desert cooled rapidly. Shadows darkened the landscape, hiding movements, blurring distances, and making every sound more pronounced. She could feel the rider's presence growing closer, each hoofbeat a reminder of the danger pressing in. He glanced at her once, and in that glance, she understood. Whatever was coming, she had to trust him completely. Her life, fragile and uncertain, now depended on a man she had known only a few hours. As darkness settled over the desert, the wind carrying whispers of smoke and shifting sands, the tension reached a peak. The riders would arrive soon, and the fragile connection between kindness, trust, and survival would be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. The desert, vast and unyielding, seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what choices would be made, what instincts would prevail, and who would endure the night. And as the first stars began to appear in the sky, tiny points of light over a land that demanded strength and courage, she knew that the night would bring revelations, dangers, and tests that neither of them could yet foresee. Their story, begun with a simple act of water and human compassion, was far from over. The desert had more to teach, more trials to impose, and the true challenge of trust, survival, and courage was just beginning. Night had fully claimed the desert, turning the sand into a deep, shifting gray and the rocks into dark silhouettes. The air had cooled sharply, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of blood and the dry temps of sagebrush. She shivered despite her jacket, not just from the cold, but from the awareness of how close danger had become. The wounded man moved with precision, leading her along a narrow ridge that offered a slight advantage in visibility, but little room to maneuver. Every step required care. One misstep could alert the riders, or throw them off balance entirely. The sounds of hooves were louder now, closer, and the rhythmic clatter seemed to echo across the desert. Magnified by the stillness of the night, she could see faint shapes moving through the darkness, horses' outlines barely distinguishable against the deep shadows. Her heart raced, and she found herself gripping the water jar as if it were a talisman. The simple vessel that had first brought them together now felt like a symbol of survival, a fragile bridge between two lives intertwined by chance. He glanced at her briefly, his eyes sharp and alert. There was no fear in the way he looked at her, only focus and determination. She realized that despite his injury, he was more prepared for this than she could ever hope to be. His breathing was controlled, his body coiled like a spring, ready to act at a moment's notice. She could see the tension in his hands as he adjusted the strap of his bag, checked his knife, and ensured that their path through the desert would remain hidden. The riders had split slightly. Circling the ridge in an effort to cover more ground, shadows moved like liquid, dark shapes blending with the rocks and dunes. She felt a rising panic, but he stayed calm, moving her behind a boulder just as a horse's hoof struck the sand near their hiding spot. She pressed herself close to the warm rock, heart hammering, and tried to control her. Breathing, listening to every sound, the shuffle of sand, the whisper of wind, the distant bark of a coyote. He muttered something in his language again, low and urgent. She couldn't understand, but she felt the meaning in the tone. Caution, patience, strategy. He was communicating not just to himself but to her, teaching her without words, guiding her through danger she had never imagined. She realized that trust was no longer optional. If she moved too quickly, if she panicked, if she failed to follow his instincts, they could be discovered, and there would be no one to save them. The riders drew closer, and she could see the glint of metal in the faint moonlight rifles resting across saddles, knives strapped to belts. They were prepared, and it was clear they expected resistance. Her stomach twisted. She had never faced people like this before, and yet she felt oddly confident because of the man beside her. He exuded strength even in weakness, and she clung to that presence as tightly as she clung to the water jar. A sudden movement in the sand caught her attention, and she realized it was one of the riders adjusting his path, moving to flank the ridge where they hid. The wind had shifted, carrying their scent more directly toward him. She felt a spike of fear and looked at him, expecting panic. Instead, he tightened his jaw, eyes narrowing, and gave her a quick nod. It was a signal, simple but powerful. Get ready, trust me. Act when I act. Time seemed to stretch. The wind carried low whispers and the scrape of sand under horses' hooves. The desert felt alive, almost sentient, every dune and rock a silent observer of the danger unfolding. She could feel her pulse in her throat, her fingers trembling as she adjusted her position behind the boulder. She watched the riders carefully, noting how they moved in patterns, how they scanned the rocks, how they seemed to anticipate where a person might hide. Each second was precious, each breath a potential risk. He leaned close to her, whispering just loud enough for her to hear. When they split, we run. Stay low. Follow me. His voice was calm, authoritative, and there was no room for hesitation. She nodded, swallowing hard, realizing that every choice from this moment on would matter more than she had ever known. The riders were close now, and she felt the weight of the desert pressing down heavy and relentless, demanding attention and action. The flanking rider moved past their hiding spot, just beyond the shadow of the boulder. For a moment she thought they had been seen, and panic threatened to rise. She felt him tense beside her, the muscles in his arms coiling with readiness. She held her breath as he shifted slightly, signaling her with a subtle movement. In that instant, she understood that survival required patience, that impulsive action would be fatal. They had to wait for the perfect moment. The wind changed again. She smelled the faint hint of smoke, perhaps from a nearby fire, or maybe the remnant of a distant battle. She realized then how many stories the desert carried, how it held the memory of every struggle, every life, every death, and how it could turn even a small act, like offering water, into something with consequences she had never imagined. Her thoughts went back to the moment she had handed him the jar, the simplicity of it, and how that single gesture had drawn them together into this dangerous web. He moved suddenly, a flash of motion that startled her. She followed instinctively, rolling low across the sand, feeling the rough grains scrape her palms, hearing the distant shout of one of the riders. The sound seemed to echo endlessly in the night. She pressed herself against him, heart racing, realizing how close they were to discovery. Every second felt like an eternity, and yet he remained composed, directing her silently with glances and gestures. The flanking rider had noticed something. She could hear the horse snort and the jingle of gear as the rider adjusted position. The tension was unbearable. She felt sweat prickling on her neck despite the cool air. He whispered again, and this time, she could almost feel the strategy forming in his mind. A path, maneuver, a chance to gain advantage. The desert had turned into a battlefield, and every rock, every shadow, every grain of sand was now a part of the struggle. She realized she had begun to see him not just as a stranger or a protector, but as a force shaped by the land itself. His presence commanded respect, and she had come to trust his instincts more than her own. Yet fear still lingered, twisting inside her like a coiled snake. They were outnumbered, and she knew it. Each rider carried experience, weapons, and certainty, while they had only cunning, stealth, and a fragile bond forged in a moment of kindness. The riders were closing in. Their voices carried faintly now, words lost in the distance, but intent unmistakable. The wounded man moved to the edge of the ridge, surveying the terrain. She realized he was preparing for the final approach. Every muscle in his body was taut, every movement deliberate. And she could feel the tension radiating from him, contagious and commanding. She held herself as still as possible, trusting that his calculations were precise, that his experience would guide them through the coming danger. Suddenly, a shadow shifted too quickly, a horse's hoof striking against rock, and the nearest rider spotted something. He raised his voice, a sharp command, and she felt a surge of adrenaline so intense it burned in her veins. The desert seemed to constrict around them, the night thick with anticipation. The wind carried their scent and the echo of their movements, and she realized that the moment of reckoning was nearly upon them. He leaned close to her again, whispering one last instruction. "Hold nothing back. Trust me and stay close." The words were simple, but heavy with meaning. She nodded, heart pounding, aware that in the next few moments, everything would be tested. Courage, skill, instinct, and the tenuous trust that had grown between them. The desert held its breath alongside them, waiting for the inevitable clash that could decide their fate. The riders moved closer, their eyes scanning every shadow, every rock, every uneven patch of sand. She could hear the faint jingle of saddles, the creak of leather, the clink of metal. Her mind raced, but she forced herself to focus on him, on his movements, on the subtle signals that would guide their survival. She felt the weight of the water jar in her hands, a reminder of the act that had set all of this into motion. And she realized that every choice, every movement, now mattered more than ever as they prepared to make their move. The desert seemed to pulse with tension, the night heavy and almost suffocating. She could feel the rhythm of the approaching riders, the coiled strength of the man beside her, the fragile hope that survival was still possible. The moment before the storm had a strange clarity, a sharpness that made every sound, every shadow, every breath feel magnified. She knew that when the riders reached their position, the next few minutes could determine everything: who lived, who fell, and what kind of story would survive to be told. The moon rose higher, casting silvery light over the sand and rocks, highlighting the stark reality of the desert and the danger closing in. She pressed herself close to him, feeling the tension in his body, the quiet power that radiated from him even in injury. She understood in that moment that the coming confrontation would not just be about survival, it would be about trust, courage, and the unspoken bond formed in the heart of a merciless land. And as the first rider crested the ridge, silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon, she realized there was no turning back. The desert had drawn a line. The night had gathered its witnesses. The moment of truth was at hand. The rider paused at the crest, squinting down at the shadows where they had been hiding. The moonlight glinted off his gun, and for a tense heartbeat, it seemed as if the desert itself had frozen, holding its breath. Then the wounded man stepped forward, his eyes sharp, stance steady despite the pain that still throbbed through his body. She followed, trusting him completely now, feeling the strange calm that only comes when fear meets respect and understanding. The rider spoke, voice low and cautious, demanding answers. Words were exchanged, clipped and careful, revealing the misunderstanding that had brought them to this moment. The men had been hunting what they believed was a threat, someone dangerous who had caused harm to settlements nearby. But the wounded man's presence, his injuries, and his demeanor told a different story, one of honor, of survival, and of a life caught between worlds. Slowly, the tension began to ease, the immediate danger giving way to something more complicated, recognition of truth in a place. Where appearances often misled, she stepped forward slightly, clutching the water jar, and realized how far she had come since offering him that first drink. That simple act had sparked a chain of events that tested courage, trust, and human connection. She saw now that the desert, for all its harshness, had a way of shaping people, of teaching lessons through fire and silence. The wounded man, stoic and proud, had survived not just because of skill, but because of kindness extended when it mattered most. The riders, seeing the truth unfold, relaxed their posture, but remained alert. They had expected confrontation, but instead, they found a man who had endured far more than they imagined. Words were exchanged, the explanation given, and grudging respect formed where fear had once dominated. She felt a swell of relief, but also an understanding that the desert's trials were not about defeating others, they were about revealing character, testing patience, and teaching the value of trust. The wounded man finally allowed himself to lean against a rock, exhaustion visible in the slump of his shoulders. She approached cautiously, offering the water jar once more. He accepted it, and the gesture, simple as it seemed, carried layers of gratitude, acknowledgement, and silent connection. In that moment, she understood that the smallest acts could hold the greatest weight, that compassion could turn strangers into allies, and that the human heart could endure even in the harshest conditions. He spoke quietly, explaining fragments of his past, of the skirmishes and losses that had led him into the desert alone. She listened intently, learning of a life shaped by conflict and survival, by a land that demanded resilience and courage. His story was one of endurance, of facing impossible odds, and of maintaining a sense of honor when the world had tried to strip it away. She felt humbled, realizing how much she had learned from him in just a few hours about strength, patience, and the quiet power of integrity. The riders, having understood the truth, offered assistance. Together, they helped the wounded man to a slightly more secure position, fashioning a temporary splint for his arm from a piece of driftwood and cloth. She watched, noting the unexpected cooperation that could arise even from initial hostility, and understood that perception often shaped reality more than facts alone. The desert had taught them all a lesson about judgment, about looking beyond appearances, and about the bonds that can form in the most unlikely places. As night deepened, the desert seemed almost peaceful, a stark contrast to the tension that had dominated the evening. The stars glimmered above, cold and distant, yet comforting in their constancy. She and the wounded man sat side by side, the water jar between them, sharing the quiet and allowing exhaustion to wash over them. Words were unnecessary now. The trust, the connection, and the shared experience spoke volumes. She realized that their journey together had changed her, had shaped her understanding of courage, humanity, and the unpredictable twists of fate. Morning crept slowly across the desert, softening the shadows and bringing a muted warmth. The riders had left with a newfound respect for the man they had once hunted. Their departure a quiet acknowledgement of lessons learned in the harshness of the land. She and the wounded man prepared to move, each step deliberate, each choice guided by the understanding they had forged in the night. The desert remained vast and challenging, but they faced it together now, bound by trust and shared experience. As they walked, she asked questions gently, and he answered with patience. They spoke of survival, of the fragile beauty of the desert, and of the strange twists that had brought them together. She learned that courage was not just about facing enemies, but about extending kindness, even when it seemed risky, about trusting instincts and the human heart, and about navigating a world that was often indifferent but occasionally, through moments like this, profoundly meaningful. They reached a small spring, hidden in a rocky alcove where the wounded man knelt to drink. She followed, feeling the cool water soothe her throat and hands, a reminder of the first act that had set everything in motion. The desert around them was quiet, save for the gentle ripple of water and the distant call of birds waking with the dawn. It was a new beginning, a chance to recover, reflect, and understand what had truly transpired. He turned to her then, expression softening, and she realized that the trust they had built was no longer fragile. It had been tested by fear, danger, and uncertainty, but it had endured and even strengthened. She felt a deep respect for him, not just for his survival skills or his courage, but for his ability to maintain honor and dignity in a world that often demanded compromise. In the quiet of the desert morning, she understood the depth of the lesson. Survival alone is not enough. True strength comes from integrity, compassion, and the willingness to connect despite fear. The journey ahead remained uncertain. The desert still held challenges, unseen threats, and unforgiving terrain. Yet she no longer feared it in the same way. She knew that together, with trust and courage, they could face what came next. The wounded man's hand brushed hers briefly, a silent acknowledgement of shared trials and newfound partnership. She returned the gesture, feeling the weight of unspoken words and the strength of connection formed in adversity as they set out toward the horizon. The first rays of sun touched the desert sands, casting long shadows and highlighting the beauty of the land that had tested them so severely. She thought of the riders who had once pursued them, now gone, and realized that danger often teaches as much as it threatens. The lessons of courage, patience, and trust were imprinted on her now, and she understood that every act, no matter how small, could carry profound consequences. They walked in silence for a time, letting the desert speak in its own way, the whisper of wind, the crunch of sand underfoot, the distant rustle of wildlife. She reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple offering of water, and she saw clearly how acts of compassion could ripple through circumstances, shaping outcomes and altering lives. The wounded man had survived because of his skill, but also because of trust and the humanity extended to him when it mattered most. At last, he reached a high ridge overlooking a valley below. The desert stretched endlessly, golden and serene in the morning light. She felt a profound sense of awe, the kind that comes from realizing one has endured, learned, and grown. The wounded man stood beside her, gazing at the horizon, and she felt a quiet gratitude for the journey they had shared. The dangers were behind them for now, but the lessons and the bond they had forged would remain forever. He spoke quietly, words slow and measured about the desert's survival, and the choices that define a person. She listened, feeling the weight of experience in each phrase. His story, once shadowed by injury and fear, was now illuminated by understanding, connection, and the recognition that even in a harsh world, humanity and courage could endure. She nodded, absorbing the wisdom, the reflection, and the silent strength that came from surviving not just the land, but the fear and uncertainty it imposed. The water jar, empty now but once a symbol of kindness, lay at her feet. She looked down at it and realized that it had carried more than water. It had carried trust, hope, and the first step in a chain of events that had brought them through the desert alive, stronger, and changed. The jar was a reminder that even the smallest gestures could shape destiny, a lesson she would carry forever. Together, they descended into the valley, the morning sun warming their backs and the desert opening up before them. The challenges would continue, the land would still test them, and life would remain unpredictable. Yet they walked with confidence now, with trust forged in adversity, and with a quiet understanding that the greatest strength lies in courage, compassion, and the bonds formed when they are tested to the limit. And as they disappeared into the vast landscape, the desert stretched behind them, serene yet indifferent, holding the memory of danger, courage, and humanity within its sands. The story that had begun with a simple act of offering water had ended. Now, with understanding, survival, and the quiet triumph of trust, leaving both of them changed forever.